countdown, we have the deer head. Posted on Reddit by RipeOTCDXVI, they claim to be a forest ranger at Yellowstone National Park. One day they were out exploring a part of the park called Lamar Valley, which is about 11 miles from the nearest road. While on the trail, they stumbled upon something very shocking: a perfectly severed deer head. There was no blood whatsoever, and it was cut off with precision. Now obviously, since this is a park, rangers come across dead animals all the time, but never in such perfect condition. Also, the head was completely uneaten. So now the question is, who did this? Why did they do this? How did they do this? Moving on to number 9, we have the abandoned tent. Reddit user NotSoSingleBuck was at work one day when he came across a campsite that was set outside of the designated campsite area, which is against the rules of the park, so he went to investigate. In the tent, he found a sleeping bag, some dirty clothes, lots of canned food, and a teddy bear. The whole tent smelled of cigarette smoke. There was nothing that he could do though until the individual returned. He didn't want to wait all day, so he just took the open food to prevent animals from being attracted to it, and left a note explaining where he had taken the food and why. 2 weeks later, he returned to the tent and it had remained untouched. As a result, him and his team cleared out the tent. Whatever happened to the person staying in the tent remains a huge mystery. Did a wild animal get to them? Did they fall off a cliff? A body was never found, so we may never know. Coming in at number 8, we have the wolf pack. This story happened 3 years ago by an old-timey forest ranger that worked in Montana. He was out roaming around on his ATV when he saw an older lady in the distance. She was screaming as 6 wolves closed in around her. The ranger drove down to her as fast as he could, yelling and honking, trying to scare away the wolves. But when he got there, she was nowhere to be found. The only sign of her was a single ring with a black stone which was on the ground where the woman was standing. Seems like the wolves got to her and carried her away. Coming in at number 7, we have the strange blue lights. This person used to work as a ranger at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. There's a place on this ranch that is said to be haunted. There's a number of urban legends surrounding this place, like, oh, it's the portal to the underworld, or it's home to an ancient cursed burial ground, you get it. There's also this very eerie legend saying that on some nights, blue lights can be seen. One story claims that a hiker saw an eerie figure on the trail. The figure was tall and emitting a blue light. Well, legend goes that the blue lights are coming from a shaman that guards the ground. Anyways, obviously these are just legends, right? Well, one night the ranger was out with a scout troop when they saw a bunch of weird lights coming from a trail. These were the infamous blue lights talked about in multiple legends. Everyone was so freaked out that they got out of there as fast as they could. Now, let's just say that they're all believers. In our 6th spot, we have these skinned animals. So a couple of years ago, 2 forest rangers were on their way to a far location when it got dark out. As a result, they had to camp overnight. But during the night, they were woken up by the sound of footsteps right outside of their tent. All of a sudden, they heard a number of people yell, "Get out!" The 2 rangers packed up as fast as they could and got the hell out of there. The next morning, the cops went to check out the area and found 4 skinned animals nailed to the trees surrounding their campsite. Okay, that is horrifying, and I have a number of questions. Number 1, who the heck were these people? Number 2, what were they doing there? Number 3, what the heck? And number 4, what the heck? Seriously, that is so messed up. Were they doing some satanic ritual and the forest rangers ruined it, or what? We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Wendigo. Imagine going out camping with some friends and encountering a Wendigo during your trip. Wouldn't that be insane and terrifying? Like if you agree. Well, this happened to a forest ranger and a bunch of his friends. So the group went out camping and all was going well. Until the second night. During the night, all 4 of the men woke up to a loud, high-pitched scream. They assumed it was just the coyote. But the next morning, they were in for a surprise. By their campsite, they found a bunch of animal guts everywhere. The ranger described it as if there was a bomb in an animal and then it went off. There were just fur, blood, and flesh everywhere. That night is when they came across the monster that devoured the animal. They were out investigating a sound when they saw a weird tall figure move in the distance. It was about 6 feet tall and did not look like an animal and did not look like a human. When the creature spotted the men, it took off in a flash. They believe that they encountered a Wendigo. Wendigo, Wendigo. Coming in at number 4, we have the man in the woods. This next individual was a park ranger on a small island. The island could only be accessed by a private boat. During the summer, there would be hordes of people there, but during the off-season, the ranger would be the only one on the island. One night, the ranger decided to take a hike around the entire island. Yeah, at night, when it's dark. He thought it would be a fun challenge for himself. Plus, there was no cell or internet service, so you know, what else could you really do? While he was out on his hike, he heard a noise coming from behind him. He turned around and standing behind him was a crazy old man. He was a super pale and super tall man with dark hair. The man gave out a creepy smile and then cackled. The ranger ran for his life, and this crazy man ran after him until the ranger made it back safely to his cabin. In the morning, he went back on the trail he had been on, and there were no sets of other footprints, only his own, as if the man had never been there at all. Moving on at number 3, we have the polar bears. So this next individual was a park ranger in the northern part of Ontario, Canada. In the middle of the night, she woke up to hear something outside of her tent. She opened her eyes and saw the head of a polar bear peeking into her tent. Imagine waking up and seeing that thing breathing in your face. Like, what would you do? Well, the correct answer is don't panic and don't frighten the bear. Thankfully, that's what the ranger did. She stayed calm and eventually the bear left the tent. That could have ended much worse for this woman. She got lucky. Like, I think I would have peed myself, seriously. In our second spot, we have the river accident. A man named Kevin Uxbridge used to be a ranger at Yosemite. One day, he was making his way through the gate, which was along a river, when he heard a huge commotion. People were yelling and screaming and crying. Well, turns out there was a husband and wife standing by the river. The husband was taking a picture of his wife and kept telling her to back up, you know, so he could get a good shot. Well, she ended up backing up too far and she fell into the river. The river was pretty violent that day, so within seconds she was swept under. It took the ranger and firefighters 2 months before they could find her body. The worst part? Her body was found in the swimming hole when the river had settled. People were swimming in there just days before they found her. And in our number 1 spot, we have the ghostly body. This next story comes from a trail ranger. One time, he noticed that there was a bunch of illegally placed wildlife cameras around, so he went around taking them down. Things were going well until he started hearing a bunch of weird voices. He hopped back on his ATV, but the battery was disconnected, so he couldn't drive off. He was then stuck there waiting for someone to pick him up. They were an hour away and it was getting dark. He decided to sit down and make a small fire. Before he knew it, the voices were back, this time getting louder and louder. Finally, he could hear what was being said. It was 2 hunters arguing over a kill. That's when all of a sudden he heard a loud bang. It was a gunshot. After that, he smothered the fire and hid until his coworkers arrived. The next day, the two came back with the police to investigate the area. After about an hour of looking, they came across a shallow grave. In it, they found a dead man who had been shot in the face. The freakiest part? It was just the skeleton of the man. He had been there for years. So it seems like he heard ghosts reenacting the murder that happened years ago or something like that. I don't know, it is so freaky. Starting off this countdown, we have the missing hunter. In December of 2020, a 45-year-old hunter was deemed missing after not returning from an afternoon hunt. 2 rangers were sent out into the forest to go look for this man. All throughout the night on December 4th, the rangers looked for him. They found tracks and some personal items left by this hunter, but the hunter himself was nowhere to be found. Early in the morning, they were joined by 4 more rangers to help search through the thick and swampy forest. Just after 3:03 p.m., the hunter was found. Sadly, not alive. He was found in Shaker Mountain Wild Forest. The cause of death is still unknown. Everyone was hoping that this wasn't going to be the outcome. Sadly, what they feared the most came true. In our 9th spot today, we have the aliens. This forest ranger almost got beamed up by a damn UFO spacecraft. Sounds crazy, right? Let me explain. So it was the middle of the night and the ranger was in his cabin chilling when all of a sudden he heard this weird electronic sound coming from outside. He described it as a mixture of TV static and a high-pitched ringing sound. He followed the sound to the middle of the woods and all of a sudden he was surrounded by this bright blue light. He says it was so blinding that he could barely see. He looked up and swore he saw a big silver craft hovering above him. He was so scared he ran back to his cabin and locked himself himself inside. The light stayed in the spot in the woods for a couple of minutes before disappearing. So like, what is that? That for sure had to be aliens, right? Coming in at number 8, we have the creepy stranger. And if you guys are liking this video so far and want to see more spooky content, then smash that like button. One forest ranger told a time he was leading a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. He was with 8 middle school kids and 1 co-instructor. Once they reached the top of the mountain, they settled down for the night. He decided to spend the night in a hammock since it was so nice out. That night though, around 10:30 p.m., he saw something approach the campsite. As it got closer, he saw that it was a person. Now, they were in the middle of nowhere, so it was weird for people to be up there. Apparently, this person just stood there watching the camp for 30 minutes. And then he sat down under a tree facing the camp, just staring. The man stayed there until 3:30 a.m. That's when he got up, surveyed the camp one last time, and then left. Okay, what the heck? Like, what was this dude doing? Was he waiting for the ranger to fall asleep so that he could attack? Was it even a human, or was it a humanoid creature disguising themselves as a human, okay? These are the questions that we need answers to, people. In our 7th spot, we have the humanoid creature. Speaking of humanoid creatures, the forest ranger in this next story might have really encountered one. This happened a number of years ago in Fishkill, New York. According to the ranger, the area that they were in was quite isolated in the woods. You have a bunch of cabins on top of a mountain, but each cabin is like half a mile apart from each other. One night at 1 a.m., he was cutting through the woods to get to his girlfriend's cabin when he heard a weird rustling coming from the woods. He was expecting it to be a bear or other creature, but what he saw was far more frightening. A 3-foot-tall humanoid creature jumped out of the bushes and just stared at him. It was standing on its 2 feet and it had 2 arms, but it definitely did not look like a person. He tried to get closer to get a better look at it, but that's when it took off. He said that the way that it ran was very odd. It was very mechanical moving and ran super fast. To this day, he still doesn't know what it is that he saw. So I'm gonna go with a lost house elf because his description just reminds me of Dobby from Harry Potter. In our 6th spot, we have the missing friends. This forest ranger shared the time he was sent out to look for a group of missing teens. They were out camping, but they never returned home. So this forest ranger and another went out in the general direction the teens were camping in. They were about 35 kilometers deep into the woods when they started noticing some odd things, like sticks carved like spears sticking out of the ground, creepy things carved into trees, and stuffed animals hanging by nooses up in the trees. Everything was freshly carved, meaning someone had just been there and done that. So that means they were lurking around there somewhere close. They kept on hiking until it was dark and settled down until the next day. That next morning, they noticed a bunch of ripped clothing and shoe prints. They thought, okay, maybe the group of teens were nearby, but just then they got a call on their radio saying that the teens had been found. So now, here's what he's wondering. Who did the ripped clothing and footprints belong to? And who created that creepy, weird shrine they encountered the day before? Coming in at number 5, we have the lost campers. A couple of years ago, this forest ranger was out practicing winter climbing when he came across a tent in the middle of nowhere. He got closer to it and found it had been ripped open, and it was badly faded from the sun. He crawled inside and found the typical camping stuff: sleeping bag, clothes, dried food, etc. But he also found a newspaper in there dated from 5 years ago. This tent had been up there for 5 years. Who knows what happened to whoever was staying in there? Isn't that creepy? Moving on, at number 4, we have the witch. According to this user, his grandfather used to be the equivalent to a mountain ranger down in Mexico. Well, one night he was out patrolling when he heard the sounds of a baby crying. He looked around but couldn't see anything, so he followed the sound of the crying. This is when it gets wild, people. He's walking towards the sound when all of a sudden something flies up into the air and then towards the mountains. He is adamant that it was a witch. He panicked and ran the opposite direction and got in his car and got out of there as fast as he could. Smart man. Coming in at number 3, we have the cage. Okay, this one is super freaky, but a forest ranger was out patrolling the area when they came across a big cage with a full-sized mattress in it. The cage also had a container for water and some canned food, as if they were keeping a person captive inside. Yeah, not an animal, a human. The worst part, the mattress was heavily stained with what looked like blood. Dude, what the heck? Who was in that cage and what happened to them and why were they being held captive? I need to know. In our second spot today, we have the search and rescue. This next park ranger was called in to help locate a missing man in his 20s. He had gone hiking and never returned home. Now, when he got the call about this disappearance, it was nighttime, which makes everything a whole lot harder, but also creepier. So he hiked a few miles and then set up camp when it became really late. At around 2 a.m., he woke up to go to the bathroom when he saw a moving light at the base of a cliff. It looked like someone was flashing their flashlight at him. So the next morning, he set off in that direction. As soon as they got there, they saw the missing man's body at the end of the cliff. He had fallen 60 feet down. Here's the creepy part. The coroner arrived and said that the man had been dead there for 48 hours. So, who was out there shining that flashlight then? Did somebody dispose of his body off of the cliff that night? Or was it the man's ghost helping the rangers locate his body? Either way, I got the chills. And in our number one spot today, we have the thumb. This story, by far, is the scariest one on this list, but it's also the shortest one. Posted on Reddit by user Homeless Homie, he said, and I quote, "I saw a human thumb nailed to a tree." That one sentence is chilling. For starters, whose thumb does that belong to? Where is that person? What happened? And then who nailed his thumb to the tree? Okay, that is so unnerving and unsettling. And that's all the details he left us with, so we don't know if they ever solved this creepy mystery.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Through Him. This one comes from Reddit user SuperDan23. Now I thought I'd start off with a really strong one. Hopefully this doesn't creep you guys out too much. SuperDan said, "I worked at a summer camp where the cabins were arranged in a circle, a center building that was used for showers and bathrooms. One night, one of my campers, about 12 years old, asked to go to the bathroom just as we had all gotten into bed. I tell him to take his bunkmate and to go quickly. The bathroom building is about 100 feet away. The kids are kind of dorking around like kids do, and they take off for the bathroom running. All of a sudden, I hear screams that still haunt me. Hysterical, choking for air, horror movie screams. I jump up and run out, and I see the two boys sitting on the ground right outside the bathrooms, and they are kind of holding each other. After a few minutes, they calm down enough, and they say they ran through a man. They say he appeared right before they got to the bathroom door and was standing in the doorway. They didn't have enough space to stop, and when they put their hands up, they went through him and into the door. They said there was cold air around him, and that was it. He was gone. They said he had a suit on and slicked black hair and was smiling. We had to call the parents, and they both went home the next morning. No kid goes home from summer camp, man. It still freaks me out." Next up at number 9 now, we have Good Bones. Now this is a short one, but it's packed with just as much creepiness as the rest of our stories in today's video. It comes from Reddit user The Copy Paste Life. They said, "Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day a kid finds molars. The teeth look like human molars, but the teacher said it was a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later they found a corpse with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All of its teeth were missing. Local newspaper covered the story, but all they had to say was, 'Thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth.'" Okay, so with that story, the bones and teeth and the skull were all creepy, but you know what else is creepy? That newspaper. Who hears about a potential murder victim and jokes about spooky skeletons? That is really creepy. I'm just saying. Moving on to number 8 now, we have Womp. This one was posted to Reddit by OG Dinosaur. Now he admits that he's not a ranger, but rather an archaeologist who heads out to the wilderness to do studies, but in my opinion his story is too good to miss out. He said, "A few years back we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of BC. All the crew had gone home and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We head out from the motel an hour or so into the bush, middle of nowhere, along deactivated logging roads. Closest town is miles and miles away. We hike out to this one area we had found a site at a few weeks previously. Now for some reason the whole area just felt off. So we get down to business, and about 15 minutes after being hunched over mapping, there is this weird, deafening whomp sound. Like I could feel pressure in my ears. I immediately looked at my boss about 20 feet away, and he is white as a ghost staring back at me. Standing there, it happens again. Whomp. Ear pressure and chest pressure, like I was just squeezed. Chills all over my body and every hair is standing on end. My boss just looks at me and says, "Let's go." We grab all of our stuff and speed hiked back to the truck. We never discussed it again. No clue what it was, but I have never been so freaked out in my life. 10 years later, and I still get the chills. Moving on to number 7 now, we have black magic. This one comes from Reddit user Rooston Dayard. It's about to step up a gear here, guys. She said, I was a ranger at a coastal park in South Carolina, down on the islands. I saw the aftermath of some truly creepy black magic. When you open the park, you must also begin with a complete park tour, including riding down the beach. Several times in the 2 years I worked there, I came across turkeys chained up and chickens left in homemade crates for the high tide to come in and kill. Strange artifacts would always be scattered around the crest of where high tide hit. Everything from random bones to swatches of clothing could be found. Half the staff that worked there were Gula. They would tell me that was black magic, not to be confused with root magic. Black magic would be the bad kind, where you have to sacrifice life and are asking for something bad to happen. Root magic is a good magic, where you're just asking for love, health, luck, etc., and not sacrificing a life. It always freaked me out seeing it and bummed me out to clean it up. Next up at number 6 now, we have the jungle spirit. Now, do you guys believe in the spirits living in trees? If you don't, you might find this one interesting. It comes from Reddit user Morgan Explosion, who said, I was working at a survey station deep in the Malaysian jungle in Borneo, 4 hours in 4x4s to reach this spot from the nearest village. I was sleeping in one of the dorms with some of the rangers we were working with, 5 people total in the dorm. That night, I was having a nightmare and woke up at about 2 AM to the sound of footsteps outside. Whatever it was fairly big and sounded bipedal. It stopped right outside the window, so I'm staring back at the window trying hard to see. It was pitch black in the whole station since it runs on solar power and the batteries give out around midnight. Suddenly, one of the rangers shifted in her bed, making a noise, and I could hear whatever it was running away quite fast. Being a rather skeptical person in general, I woke up and asked the rangers the next day about it. They adamantly believed that it was a jungle spirit coming to check us out. The station stood on stilts, so the window sits about 10 feet off the ground. I asked about the possibility of it being a wild animal, but they said the only thing big enough to make that large of a footprint would have been a sun bear or a cloud leopard. They said it's generally unheard of for those animals to make it that close to the survey station, since there are usually people milling about. The rangers have heard the footsteps before, and they firmly believe that a jungle spirit was roaming about the site. Next up at number 4 now, we have the Crowbar. This one came from Reddit user Tinge of the Ginge, which is a great name, I must say. This one sounds more like an actual horror movie though. They said, I'm a field biologist and my job takes me to some fairly remote places. I have 2 favourite stories. The first was the time I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail and heard someone walking up a nearby path. All the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles, and when he saw me, he started yelling, I've got a crowbar, I've got a crowbar. I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like, nice crowbar, and then ran the mile or so back to my truck. And that's the reason why I always carry mace and a big knife now. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the head. This one comes from Reddit user RipeOTCDXVI. They're actually a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. That's the one that looks amazing, but it could blow up at any moment and end humanity. Yeah, that one. Anyway, they said, a couple weeks ago I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance, perfectly intact. Now this is weird because I have seen wolf and bear kills, and I used to find cougar kills in SD with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. No catching, no scat, right in the middle of the trail, but again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the path. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the Howling. This one comes from Reddit user Jack Jack's Mac. He said, I have seen weird lights, heard weird sounds, found weird stuff in the woods before, but the one that sticks out was years ago. I was camping at a friend's property in South Texas. I am asleep in my tent, and all of a sudden I wake up in the middle of the night. One of those from dead sleep to wide awake in half a second moments. I can feel something outside the tent, but I don't want to look. I have considerable camping, hiking experience, so I'm not freaking out too badly. I very slowly unzip the top of the tent, being as quiet as I can. I look out of the tent, and there is very little light. We were camped under a giant oak tree, so big the branches dipped down and connected with the ground before growing back up again. It is a huge tree, and there are lots of shadows and weird shapes. Anyway, as my eyes start to adjust, I realize there are about 40 or more coyotes all milling around the campsite, just slowly walking around, sniffing here and there, almost ghost-like in their quietness. I slowly zipped the flap back up and laid there for about 30 minutes before I fell back to sleep. In the morning, in the light, you couldn't tell anything had been there. The next night we heard the pack howling for hours in the distance. That was almost freakier than seeing them 10 feet away.